warmed up.
Okay, so I'm Jean-Baptiste. Thanks a lot for organizing this. It's a pleasure to present the book to people that are really interested in energy. As you will have noticed, I'm not a specialist of anything about electricity or even renewable or how you stabilize the grid with renewable or whatever. It's really a historical perspective that I offer. Basically, the book started as a kind of interrogation. How come that this idea of energy transition seems so natural? You know, everybody is for the energy transition. On the other hand, it is a very, very strange future. So that's really what struck me at the beginning was the fact that we keep talking about energy transition as if we really, knew what it meant. And when I say that everybody is talking about energy transition, I mean people like, our leaders, like John Kerry, a US Democrat politician, who was the US envoy for climate change. He talked about energy transition being the new industrial revolution. And really, I mean, this kind of phrase that keeps repeating over and over again and again really triggered my interest because for me, it seemed clear that the idea of energy transition is based on a false history. You know, behind this idea that the energy transition is the new industrial revolution, there is this assumption that the industrial revolution was a kind of energy transition, that we have done energy transition in the past, and that we need to emulate those past energy transition to make a new energy transition happen. I'm not going to multiply the examples, but even more striking is the fact that if you take the last IPCC report, of the group three. In the IPCC, you know, the famous intergovernmental group of experts on climate change, there are three groups, and the third group is about mitigation, about reduction, how you reduce CO2 emissions, how you make an energy transition happen. And even in this, the most official expertise, you've got a false history that is appearing in the first chapters, like sentences like energy transitions can occur faster than in the past, or a low carbon energy transition needs to occur faster than previous transitions. Um, as you all know, I guess, among energy nerds, I mean, those past energy transitions at a global level, which is really what matters for climate change, they are kind of mysterious. I mean, we have never consumed as much coal as 2025, never as much oil, as much gas, and perhaps more surprisingly, as much wood energy. I mean, wood energy has expanded a lot in the 20th century. Right now, wood energy is twice as much as nuclear energy because wood energy is very important for the poor world, and it has also grown a lot in the rich world in the 20th century, right? So we are living with all sources of energy, and despite this obvious fact, we keep talking about, new and high-tech energies. The other thing is, which is very basic, but I think it's worth underlining, if they talk about energy transition in the past, the experts of the IPCC Group 3, it's because they confuse the dynamics of technology with the dynamics of energies and materials, and the two are very different. What I said about the cumulative nature of history of energy is actually true of every raw material. All raw materials keep expanding in the 20th century, in the 21st century. Um, there are very few raw materials whose global consumption has decreased. There is only, I mean, a handful of examples. For instance, acetose has decreased because of prohibition in certain countries. The only raw material that has decreased because of a kind of competition is sheep. It is the only example that we have. So, I mean, it's a very basic point, a very obvious point, but I think we should really have that in mind when we talk about innovation as a way out of our climate and environmental crisis. We are saying a very strange thing. Despite all the innovation that we knew of during the 20th century, all raw materials have increased. In a way, raw materials are never obsolete. Technology sometimes are obsolete, but raw materials for the moment are never obsolete. If they talk about energy transition, it's also because history of energy has been told in a transitionist frame. It is true that if you take the main books in history of energy, they are obsessed with the problem of transitions. How we transited from an economy based on wood and hydraulic energy to an economy based on coal, and then to an economy based on oil. Of course, obviously, I mean, it makes perfect sense to tell the story like this if you look at relative shares, the shares of each energy in the mix of certain national countries. This is a famous graph taken from Power to the People. They trace the share of coal in the energy mix of certain Western European countries. And if you look at this graph, it seems obvious that the word transition is pretty good, right? I mean, coal was virtually non-existent in most of the countries, and it is very important, like accounting for 90% of energy of Germany, for instance, in the early 20th century. But that does not mean that the traditional energies decrease. On the contrary, I mean, during the 19th century, all energies increased. Hydraulic energy has increased a lot during the so-called Industrial Revolution, and it is thanks to coal, actually. Wind energy has increased a lot in the 19th century during industrialization, thanks to modern windmills, especially in the US. And human energy, I mean, muscle energy has increased enormously in the 19th and 20th centuries. There are more humans, they are better fed, and they're using more productive tools, more efficient tools. And all these kind of technologies, which sometimes we call low tech, but it's probably high tech from the late 19th century, actually, we're talking about, is extremely important in the history of economic growth. I mean, there are really ways of moving stuff which are much more efficient, but they are not very much present in our imaginary, the imagination of really what are important technologies. We'll probably think about the steam engine, but not so much about the rubber wheel or the ball bearing. Very simple tech. I mean, not that simple technologies actually, but technology that reduce friction. They are very important. The other point, so obviously, I mean, as everybody knows, history of energy is a history of accumulation, not transition, obviously. The other thing, which is probably more original, is in my book, it is that I tell the history of energy as a history of entanglement, of symbiosis. I will just comment on this graph, which is an important graph from the historiography. It represents the consumption of energy per capita in Britain from the 16th to the 19th century. So there is this cumulative aspect, obviously, but there is also a transitionist narrative, because if you look at firewood, it decreased in absolute values and it peters out and disappears in the mid 19th century. Does it mean that wood has disappeared from the energy system of Britain in the 19th century? No, not at all, because obviously you need a lot of wood, timber, to extract coal. To the extent that Britain in the 20th century industrialized, Britain consumed more wood only in the shape of pit props, so to extract coal, than it had burned in the 18th century, right? So coal and wood should not be thought as in competition. They compete for certain market, for the steel making, obviously, and coal displaced wood for steel production in the 19th century Britain. But nevertheless, coal is completely dependent on wood. This is true for uh, all sorts of industrialized countries. So this is the consumption of mining timber in Europe, USSR, USA, China. As you can see, there is really a skyrocketing consumption of timber mining in the 1960s in USSR. It's because you got timber from Russia that is used to support the roofs of the mines of Ukraine. So you have to imagine that the production of coal depends on a kind of exchange, international commerce of wood and coal on a kind of continental scale. For the case of Britain, they had to import their pit props from the Baltic, from southwestern France, from Portugal. So it's really a wide area, that allowed the production of pit props. By the way, there are very often like US or European engineers in China at the beginning of the 20th century. They keep explaining that there is a lot of coal in China, but it is very difficult to exploit because they lack timber. So, this connection is really important, I think, to understand economic growth of different countries in the 20th century. So basically, what I really want to underline is that wood is not secondary in the history of energy of industrialized countries. It does not become marginal. It is absolutely central. It is crucial. Without abundant timber, industrialized countries would have had very little coal, very little steam, almost no steel, therefore no railways, no industrialization whatsoever, right? You got the same story about coal and oil. The idea that there is a transition from coal to oil in the 20th century is clearly misleading because oil is mainly used to power automobiles, and to make an automobile, you need a lot of coal. This is a picture from the famous Ford factory on the Riviera Rouge in the 1950s. As you can see, there is a big stack of coal because coal is the main ingredient going into a car. In the 1930s, automobile manufacturers needed 7 tons of coal to produce a car. And it is more or less the same amount in terms of weight with, that the car would use as for petroleum in its lifetime. So basically, you really need to remember that automobile is as much a coal technology as in petroleum technology. And nowadays, if you look at the last life cycle assessment of automobile production in China, I came across a paper estimating that to produce a car in China, you need between 2 3 tons of coal. So a car is a big stack of coal, basically. Um, and then it's even actually more important than that because all the oil infrastructure depends on steel, from its extraction, storage, transportation, combustion. It's all dependent on steel, and steel is massively dependent on coal. There are some calculations made for the case of Britain in the interwar period. For each ton of oil burnt in Britain in the 1930s, 2.5 tons of coal was needed to produce the infrastructure and the automobile that allowed the combustion of oil. And then when you've got oil, you've got trucks, and all ponderous materials became cheaper, so you use more of them. Um, just imagine what it takes to distribute coal before the dump truck. Basically, you could have abundant and cheap coal only on the side of railways and canals. But thanks to dump truck, coal can be distributed to a much broader and varied area. Um, in the same way, you got plenty of symbiosis between wood and oil. It's not very well known, but I mean, except by historians of oil, but oil was completely dependent on timber until the 1930s. It is, I mean, the oil rigs were built from timber, 30 tons of timber for each oil rig, and there are over almost a million oil rig which had been set up, derricks, sorry, not rig, derricks, a million derricks that had been built in the US before the 1930s. One anecdote, which historian of technology like me is the fact that really the big age of wooden barrels, the peak of wooden barrels is the 1920s. And the biggest wooden barrel manufacturer in the world was John D. Rockefeller, because the Standard Oil possessed enormous barrel factories, which were very modern, using machines to produce barrels, which was really a big problem because it made unfair competition to, for instance, French wooden barrel manufacturers who kept complaining about the cheap wooden barrel coming from the USA to transport oil, and then it was washed and reused to transport wine. So it was really a disaster on all sorts of problems, creating all sorts of problems. Sorry, I cannot. Okay. Um, the other thing is once you got trucks, of course, and a modern forestry industry, wood is becoming cheaper and cheaper, so you use more of it, and also wood energy. One of the big transformation of the energy system globally since the 1960s is probably the rise of charcoal. Charcoal seems like an old technology, or it is simply reserved for barbecues, but in fact, it has been a really fast expanding source of energy since the 1960s, and it is because of the urbanization in the poor world. Charcoal is a powerful tool to transport wood energy. Transporting wood is complicated. Transporting charcoal is much easier. And when you look at statistics from the megalopolises of sub-Saharan Africa, cities like Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, they consume each year over 2 million tons of charcoal. Just to give you a point of comparison, because it's really important to compare, Paris in the 1860s, which is probably the city that consumed the most charcoal in the world at that time, was only 100,000 tons of charcoal. I mean, one city like Lagos probably right now consumes more wood than France or Germany in the late 19th century, right? So there's really been a very strong expansion of wood energy and of charcoal in particular. And strangely enough, sorry, the slide is in French. I did not notice. Strangely enough, this represents all renewable energies in the United States and in Europe in primary energy, right? So it's a bit unfair for solar panels or windmills. It's primary energy. But nevertheless, as you can see, wood energy remains the first renewable energy, even in the rich world. There is one line that I like very much. It's liqueur noire, black liqueurs. It is a residue of the production of paper making, of the paper industry. The paper industry is a very, very large consumer of energy. It's the fourth industrial consumer of energy globally. So steel is the first, steel industry the first, cement second, chemistry and the chemical industry, and fourth, paper industry. And paper is growing because of packaging, because it remains the most used material to package goods. So here you've got this entanglement or symbiosis of energies at a far range. You've got a growing economy in the 20th century, powered mainly by coal and oil, that produced more and more goods. Those goods need to be packaged, and therefore you've got an expansion of the packaging industry, which uses wood energy to power its own processes, right? So the more you got coal and oil, the more you got wood energy as well. And one last example that shows that the history of energy transition is problematic. It is a particular example, a particularly spectacular one. It is one large power plant in Britain called Drax Power Plant. It was a coal power plant that was inaugurated in 1972. And then it was reconverted to biomass around the year 2000. Each year, Drax consumes, well, it depends on the year, but around 10, 12 million tons of wood pellets. And these wood pellets are extracted from Canada and the US mainly. What is striking it is that right now, with just these power plants, Britain burns at least 4 times more wood than it did in the 18th century. So after 2 centuries of energy transition, we reached the great result that Britain is using at least 4 times more to produce energy than it did before, making all these transitions, right? And even more striking, perhaps, it is that those 10, 12 million tons of wood represents only 1.5% of British energy, which shows the inanity or the stupidity of pretending that you can have the same kind of economy that was built with fossil fuels to have it like fit in the organic economy with biomass. I mean, the things do not add up at all. Nevertheless, we keep talking about biofuels or sustainable aviation fuels that will be produced from biomass. But I mean, it's just that the quantity are not there. Another example would be the case of sustainable aviation fuels. I mean, as you all know, I guess aviation is extremely difficult to decarbonize, not to say impossible. So one of the possibility would be to use oil, vegetable oils or animal oils, actually fats from slaughterhouses. But there is not just enough fat or vegetable oil to run airplanes, not at all. So I don't want to talk too much, but basically then the second part of the book, just to really in a very schematic way, the second part of the book is, answering a very simple question, given the fact that obviously history of energy is not a history of transitions, it's something different. It's probably the history of the symbiotic expansion of all materials, all energies at a global level. Because I've not talked about international commerce, but of course it is part of the argument. It's quite easy for Western European countries to get out of coal or decarbonize while importing massive amounts of goods that are produced with coal from, Asia, America, or whatever. Anyway, so if we understand that the history of energy is certainly not a history of transition, of course, the obvious question is how come that, this word has become so prominent? Where does it come from? Who started to talk about energy transition? So the second part of the book, very briefly, is the kind of intellectual genealogy of this notion. And the first point to start the history on the right foot is to recognize that it is a fairly recent notion. For most of the time, people did not talk about energy transition because there was no such energy transition. You can see that in the kind of futurology of the 1950s, 1970s. They rather see the future energy like this. Not This is a graph made by a promoter of solar energy in the US in 1972. For him, everything is going to expand. Solar energy, obviously, but also nuclear, oil, gas, and so on, coal. So basically, for a long period of time, the future of energy was seen as a bigger present, not as a radically transformed present. Rather as everything is going to expand. There is room for every energy. And then the idea of energy transition came from a very, very particular group of scientists. I called them the atomic Malthusians because they were both promoter of atomic energy. Most of them went through the Manhattan Project, and I think they also cultivated a feeling of guilt about the nuclear bomb, and they also wanted to explain that nuclear energy was also the kind of miracle technology that would allow industrial civilization to prosper across millennia, not centuries, but millennia. And they are also Malthusians because they were preoccupied by the uh, growing scarcity of natural resources and the growing population. The man who invented the word energy transition is probably this person, Harrison Brown, nuclear chemist, who actually, when you hear energy transition, actually you are hearing a word from atomic physics. At the beginning, an an energy transition was the change of an electron around its nucleus. And then it was recycled by this character as a term of futurology. And it is mixed with this idea of demographic transition, which is a very famous and fashionable transition in the 1950s. Okay, I'm really going to go fast, but if we all talk about energy transition right now, it's probably because of a US president called Jimmy Carter, who on TV in April 1977 made a talk about energy transition. And what is striking is that he's doing a history lesson to the US citizen. Basically said that in the past, there had been two energy transition, one from fuel to coal, the second from coal to oil. And now, because of the oil shocks, we have to do a third transition. And third transition for Carter meant more coal, and in particular liquefied coal that would replace oil, and solar. In the longer term, it will be solar. He comments on this graph, which is a very, very particular way and very original, novel way of presenting energy dynamics. Of course, the trick is to put everything in shares. The share of wood, the share of coal, the share of petroleum. Normally, people would represent the dynamics of energy like this at the same time. It's certainly not the idea of transition that come to your mind when you see this graph. So I was interested in the origin of this novel way of representing energy dynamics, and I discovered that it was stolen from this character, Cesare Malchetti, who really played a crucial role in the intellectual origin of this idea of energy transition. Cesare Malchetti is interesting because he's probably one of the he's really a staunch promoter of nuclear energy. He wants huge nuclear plants being built in the oceans, in the middle of the Pacific Oceans, so they could create as much hydrogen as necessary so that nuclear energy would conquer the market of oil. And would escape from the kind of limited market of electricity production. So he would really envision a world powered with huge nuclear power plant and hydrogen. But he was also interested in the time that this system would take to become dominant. So he made really a kind of historical outlook and statistical outlook on the evolution of the global energy mix, which is really a new thing at that time. And he would propose this graph. He had a kind of mathematic model, mathematical model called Lotka-Volterra. I mean, I'm not going to enter into many details, but basically it seemed to work very well, that he could predict the future, you know. And so you got this vision of, kind of stagist vision of energy with waves. There is the wave of food, the wave of coal, the wave of natural gas, and in the end, there will be the final wave of solar, fusion, and hydrogen. Okay. This very particular way of telling the past and future of energy, he did that to contradict a group of scientists at JASA. Not, I mean, it's an institution that was set up in Austria to make energy modeling. It was really the answer to the Club of Rome. I guess you have all heard about the Limits to Growth report, the 1972 report. They were using computer to show that, after 2030, there might be, a kind of collapse of GDP population because of resource depletion or pollution. And at JASA, they wanted to use the same tool, the computers, to show that there were soft transition paths out of fossil fuels in 50 years. And they would use computer to do that. It's exactly the same question that we are asking to the energy modelers of IPCC Group 3 nowadays, right? And it's not a surprise because they are the same people. The model MEDE, MESSAGE are still used today. So in the net zero scenarios that we keep reading about it, you probably have lines of codes that have been written in the 1970s. And of course, when you create these tools, you can produce as many scenarios as you want. You just enter different parameters and you produce as many scenarios as you want. And you can even produce scenarios where you're completely out of fossil fuel in 50 years. So Cesare Malchetti, when he did this kind of graph, he wanted to demonstrate the inertia of the system. He was criticizing his colleagues, saying, don't dream. We won't be out of fossil fuel in 50 years. It won't work like this. And now he receives criticism right now by Václav Smil in particular, because he was too optimistic in a way. Look at coal. According to him, coal should have disappeared by 2020, right? And in fact, of course, as you all know, coal has expanded a lot since the 1980s. But it's really an unfair critique because Marchetti was the most pessimistic guy in the 1970s. And the fact that it turned out to be far too optimistic is kind of revealing and very worrying and very concerning. Okay, just to summarize briefly, then energy transition. So it's really in this kind of institution, intellectual production that the idea of energy transition becomes accepted as a kind of expert discourse. And this expert discourse was very much appreciated by the oil industry, the fossil fuel interest, because of course it's very convenient to explain that there is an ongoing energy transition that will arrive earlier than the climate catastrophe, which was really a powerful tool for as a kind of delaying tactics, that there is an energy transition, it is ongoing, and it was used by Exxon in the 1980s already. It was very convenient for neoclassical economists who, this is really an important point, I think. Climate economics has been shaped by people who were energy economists of the 1970s. And they reuse the same tools to reflect on the energy crisis so that for the climate crisis. And for instance, William Nordhaus, who got a Nobel Prize in economics for his work on climate change, when you look at his first papers, they are about the energy crisis. The 1973 paper called The Allocation of Energy Resources is really, oil is getting more expensive because of OPEP, because of the oil shocks and so on. Does it mean that we have to economize oil, that we have to conserve oil? No, on the contrary, we have to extract it right now while it is valuable. Because in 20 or 30 years, there will be the breeder reactor, the special kind of atomic reactor that will make oil obsolete. And 2 years later, he writes the first paper on the economic of climate change, arguing that we have to do nothing basically. I mean, what we need to do is to develop new technologies that will make energy transition so much easier. So it's no point, tightening our energy seatbelt right now, tightening our energy belt right now, because it will be so much easier to do the energy transition at the end of the 20th century. So energy transition has played really a kind of theoretical role in justifying procrastination. And then energy transition has been extremely convenient for governments, and especially for the US government when the IPCC was set up, when the Rio conference took place in 1992. And when you look at the US archive, it is quite clear that the people like John Sununu was the chief of staff of George Bush, and Robert Weinstein was the head of the IPCC Group 3, and also the chief US negotiator for the Rio conference, the very important conference that set up the UNFCCC system. I mean, it makes perfect sense to talk about energy transition, because the US were at that time the first emitter, the first technological power. So of course they will pretend to innovate to solve the issue. There is a famous discourse by George Bush father saying that there is the greenhouse effect, but we will fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. With the power of the White House, we will fight the greenhouse effect. So, I mean, this idea of energy transition, in many respects, you have to understand it as a kind of slogan, which was very convenient for the US climate diplomacy, right? So, I mean, John Sununu is very clear when he gives his order to Robert Weinstein, so the US negotiator for Rio. He said, don't uh, don't sign for targets, climate targets, for CO2 targets emissions. Don't sign for money. So no money, no target, play the technology card. And it is true that if you look at the expertise, all the scientific literature on mitigation, it is obsessed with technology. I mean, it is really a very technophile literature. I'm not going to enter in too many details, but this is like the frequency of words in all the IPCC reports. And as you can see, they deal mainly about technologies. Nuclear at the beginning in the 90s, and then renewables around after 2000. But really, it's about technology. And now it's CCS and CDR, carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal. Very, very fishy technologies, very dubious technologies that will allow you to have negative emissions in the future. But I mean, we can talk about that later if you want. And all the issues of sufficiency or even degrowth are really put on the side. They are not studied seriously. They are not considered seriously by the scientific community, which is really an issue, I think. Okay, we'll stop here. Just to really, I mean, to wrap it up in one sentence, I think that energy transition projects a false history onto a kind of elusive future. If you look at the at the forecast made by the International Energy Agency, well, they don't see an energy transition coming. They certainly see a rise of renewables, a slowdown, especially of coal, because coal is displaced by solar panels. This is true for electricity production, but certainly not a kind of energy transition that will allow us to get to net zero by 2050 or 2070. Okay, thank you. I hope it was clear.
Thank you so much for that whirlwind of the book, and thank you for writing the book. I'm going to invite anyone who wants to come off mute, introduce yourself, and ask questions. And if you haven't got any, I've got the questions from last week. So I'll step up if no one's got something to say. But please have a go so that Jean-Baptiste can get to know all of us here. Phil, you're going to have to take yourself off mute.
Here we are. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Jean-Baptiste, the thing that worries me, by the way, thank you very much for your book, which I already stated for me is one of the most important books that's come into my possession recently, or for a long time, I should actually say, is that our climate change, we'll call it the climate change problem, because we're emitting more and more CO2, is really, when you come down to it, a matter of, and I don't wish to sound like a Marxist-Leninist because I'm not, but we have a capital system in which production is the measure and the efficiency of production. And that's an area of thought that worries me, because it's in that production and consumption that we use resources, joules, and if we don't derive them from the universe, lowering its entropy, we're getting it from underneath our feet. And somehow or other, and this, I mentioned this book, I think, to Heather before you came on, A Short History of Civilization by Canadian philosopher, excuse me, which also predicts that we are basically eating ourselves up. We're eating our home up. And
here,
it
Phil?
is, in fact, pardon?
Do you have a question?
Yeah, well, no, that wasn't a question, was it? I'm making a statement. I'm sorry. Let it go because I'm rambling on. But thank you, Heather, for pointing that out. I apologize for taking other people's space up.
I mean, thank you for raising the point of capital, because I think it is true that it's quite illusory to think that we can, reach the feat of doing a real energy transition under the current economic system. I mean, it's not because, as you, I'm not necessarily a Leninist, but it is quite obvious that as long as private owners of capital decide where they want to invest, which is a very crude definition of capitalism, well, they will invest where it is worthwhile, and obviously extracting oil is still very profitable, right? So as long as you don't have a kind of, political decision on where we invest and where we disinvest, which is even more difficult, actually. It's not so much investing, which is easy, but disinvesting, of course, there will be no transition whatsoever. On the other hand, I also think that getting out of fossil fuels is more difficult than getting out of capitalism, because capitalism is a social institution. Fossil fuels are completely embedded in our even kind of, survival and biological life. Just think about agriculture, how difficult it is to get out of fertilizers, of irrigation. We're talking about really serious problems that are even more difficult to solve than changing the social organization.
If we weren't down before.
No, but I think it's important to have a realistic vision of, it's not about, being pessimistic or being a doomsayer and so on. It's just having a realistic understanding of what is at stake with climate change, that probably there will be carbon in the economy after 2050. So we have, to acknowledge the fact that we should be more ambitious and also get ready. I mean, it's tragic, but yeah.
And I think the questions we drafted sort of touched on that. I don't know if you want to go to that yet, but I'm
yeah. Keen. Do you want to introduce yourself, Peter, just so that Jean-Baptiste knows?
My name is Peter Kilby. I'm an electrical engineer, very focused on enabling the grid to decarbonize, and have overused the word energy transition up to now. So I really appreciated your book and making me think more carefully about that. And I can't remember exactly what my question was, so I hope Heather can
I'll
lead.
go to my number one on the list here. So last week we talked about the politics of limits and selling that social acceptance and maybe learning from the industries that successfully grabbed the energy transition narrative, because we need to know how to grab a narrative about the future. Do you have any thoughts on how we turn this around?
I mean, I'm an historian. I don't have really, strategic advice or whatever. I mean, I feel rather incompetent, but I think it's important for, I'm an historian. I'm paid by the French state. I don't have any investment in whatever technologies. I think it's important to recognize that we need to talk about quantities and not only about technology. I think that's really a very basic point, but I also want to make this basic point. In many, I mean, for electricity production, there is a kind of energy transition. And I think it's a really good news that renewables are becoming cheaper. But for many other sectors, solar panels are not going to help us so much, or it will take for a long, long time, and it will be much later than our climate deadlines. So I think it's important to talk about limits and prohibition and rationing, and this should be part of the discussion, and it is not. It's really what strikes me most, I think. And I want to say that it seems kind of radical now, but first of all, I mean, for many people, rationing is through the market, so many people are rationed by money, so that's not very radical, in fact. And the other thing is, when I read the debate of the 1970s, read intensively, rationing was part of the discussion because the elite was really afraid about oil shocks, about oil exhaustion, and they were also familiar with the rationing that had happened during the war, during the Second World War. And for the US, it was seen as positive because it was, the national effort to fight Nazism and so on. So, they were kind of comfortable to say that, the real solution for the growing oil scarcity is to, uh, decide on on the fair amount of oil that is allowed for each American to consume. And it's not like far left, it's like central, kind of US Democrats would be comfortable with that. So, yeah, I think we have narrowed the kind of possible discussion in our society right now. And technological innovation is really a way for me to, to put aside all this discussion. So aviation, let's not talk about limitation of aviation because we will have hydrogen airplanes. Airbus in the early 2020s was saying that by 2035 we will have a prototype of an hydrogen airplane, and now they've already delayed it by 10 years, like 10-year delay announced. It was a few months ago. Yeah, actually it will take longer than that. Boeing has said no, there won't be any hydrogen. We are not working on the hydrogen airplane because they don't believe in the technology. So basically the hydrogen airplane was just a way in the in Europe around 2020, there was really a kind of strong activism on climate change. People were starting to focus on the billionaires using their private jets to make very short trips every day. So, there was a kind of political movement here and, talking about innovation, explaining that. I remember the Minister of Transportation saying that, no, France won't be the first country to prohibit private jets. It will be the first country to invent the hydrogen jet. So it's just a way out. It's just a kind of obvious way out to the real issues and the serious issues.
Calling tactic. Colin, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself because I know you need to disappear.
Oh, all right, thank you. I do have well, it's probably not a quick question, but yeah, I've got a very bad, in light of this talk, I've got a very bad job title. It's Just Transitions Organizer for trade unions here in Victoria. So maybe I'll have to see if I can get my job title changed. I did wonder though, I mean, I loved your book and I agree very much with your analysis about limits. But I'm wondering, do you think there is some, you do acknowledge that you can probably do something in the electricity generation sector, but then that does feed through to much more of the economy in the longer term. If you can generate so much renewable energy, you can move to a hydrogen-based economy for a lot of things. You could start to remove coal, thermal and metallurgical coal from steel production and so on. Do you think that it is, do you
That's
think
the plan.
renewable energy, renewable electricity is potentially a game changer?
I think it's a game changer for electricity production, but for other sectors, I mean, the thing is, basically, I think the good question is what will we do with all this electricity? If it's to power 1.7 billion cars and growing, which will need roads and cement and all sorts of infrastructure that will, foster urbanization and bigger houses with more stuff in them and so on. You don't really solve the issue. I mean, obviously. So I think, and then the other thing about green steel. I mean, just to have a kind of, you just need to look at the figures. Hybrid, which is really the leading company for hydrogen steel. It's a Swedish company. They announced a few million tons of green steel by 2030, but we are producing 1.7 gigatons of steel, and most of it is in poor countries, China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia. Um, I mean, they won't. There will be very, very little green steel globally by 2050. It's really, I think, the most realistic thing to say. In the same way, you could do cement with CCS. Extremely expensive, extremely energy intensive. You need a lot of electricity, and it costs a lot. I have talked about that with a person in charge in Switzerland. He explained to me that Holcim, which is a major cement multinational, will not do CCS in Switzerland. So, I mean, if Holcim is not doing CCS in Switzerland, why on earth Dangote in Nigeria, a very big cement producer in Nigeria, will do CCS? No, they won't do CCS. I mean, it's I think we should, just stop being naive about, there's this technology which is available and so on. It exists, it's very small, it's extremely expensive. Most of the time there are side effects. I mean, CCS is not free at all, and it pollutes because you need a solvent to capture the CO2. I mean, yeah, I think it's important to have this kind of, technological critique of some fancy technologies. Um, but then in the end, we might be surprised, but probably, I mean, not for all sectors, not for, I think it's, uh, yeah.
Thank you. And sorry,
And
The thing about
thanks so
renewable.
much, Colin.
thank you.
Julien, you're our international, other international guest today. Do you have a question? And would you
Bonjour,
introduce
Jean-Baptiste.
yourself?
Bonjour.
Yeah, sure. I am from Quebec, so hence the bonjour. But I was curious. So I understand your point about the I didn't think about the rationing being a Second World War argument, but to some extent, I feel like I subscribe honestly to this rationale of war scale mobilization if we want to get fossil fuels out of our economy, right? And the one thing that I'm curious about is how, even though we might be able to decarbonize energy supply, to what extent we can expect reductions in material usage as a result of that decarbonization that might, right, sort of buy us time. To the extent that I think the technological transition, if it substitutes functions we already have, can sort of be some tour de passe-passe, right? We can sort of, by sleight of hand, substitute that for people, and then you don't have to negotiate on the basis of what people do. But then it buys us time to do the harder and almost longer term work of getting back to this. Well, we are in a crisis. We need to be talking about crisis response. So I'm curious what your take is on
No, I think it makes sense.
the time that we might be able to buy.
The thing is, I mean, and there are many points. The time. Basically, the Paris Agreement objective was net zero for rich world by 2050 and for the whole world by 2070. So there is very, very little time. If by 2050 we have decarbonized the electric sector, globally, it will be really a big success already, you know. I think in a way, the first, I mean, I agree that it's probable that the 2030 objective in many countries, they are achievable because it's mainly decarbonizing electricity, and it is also heat pumps. Two, working technologies that's, they are old technologies actually. I mean, it's not like it's a, but then there are much more difficult steps. So that's really what strikes me is that we have a short time vision of the problem. But I think buying time is the only thing we can do actually. We're not going to get to net zero. In many respects, it is a kind of illusion. I think it's even an objective that can drive us to wrong policies, public policies. Because to get to net zero, you need to have negative emissions. You need to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. And therefore, because we brandish this objective, there are a lot of, I mean, there's now significant amount of public money going to carbon capture and storage, which means actually the oil companies, especially Equinor in a Norwegian oil company, which really like the leader in Europe to capture CO2, transport it, and dump it under the sea. So I think instead of saying that let's do the easy thing, we buy time and we'll do the more difficult things later, which it makes sense. It might be more honest to say there are many things we won't be able to do because we don't really know how to do it. It's probably there are some sectors that are probably impossible to decarbonize. So let's talk about reduction right now instead of trying to smart to try to being smart and I think it would be a more honest position. There was a question by the previous Phil, I think. He said about he used the word game changer, an interesting word. Once again, it's not against the book is certainly not against technology. It's not the issue, but I mean, there has already been enormous technological progress in the past. And I don't think we are on the threshold of, complete transformation of the material world because of certain technologies, be it solar or whatever. I just give you an example. In the interwar period, people got rid of old steam engine and they replaced them with electric motors. And that divided by 10 the carbon intensity of the industrial force in the manufacturers. Nowadays, with solar panels, we divide by 10, 12 the carbon intensity of electricity production compared to gas power plants. So, I mean, it is a progress. Undeniably, it is a better technology, but it's not, this earth-shattering technology that will make fossil fuel vanish. This is really not true. I mean, and yeah, so that's.
We've just got a few more minutes now because I did say to Jean-Baptiste that we would just have an hour. Ian, would you like to introduce yourself briefly if you've got a very quick question? And I'll just pass to Nick and Rupert as well.
Sure. G'day. Thanks for your time, Jean-Baptiste. It's been great. I actually work in clean tech, kind of helping to integrate like things like solar and batteries into the power grid. So, am I part of the solution or problem? I don't know. Technology, I'm sure we can help.
So Ian works for Switched In, which a couple of us will have heard of. Rupert, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
I did have one question.
Oh, go on.
Hopefully it's quick. Are there any fuel sources or energy sources that have stuck out that we've actually kind of successfully managed to transition away from for you, Jean-Baptiste? And what do you think we can learn from that? So, for me at least, whale oil was one of them. And I think there was like maybe a throwaway sentence or something about what drove that transition. Are there other examples that stick out for you of a successful transition away that we might be able to learn from?
Okay, very quickly. The common story about whale oil is that oil saved the whales, in the 1860s. Of course, it's a myth. There were three times more whales killed in the 20th century than in the 19th century. And interestingly enough, they were killed with motorboats, powerful, and plenty of other technologies. And the last drops of whale oil was used probably for airplanes because it's a very interesting lubricant for certain parts of the airplane. So it was really connected to oil technologies. So if there is one moral to tell from this story, it is that it was not a technological evolution that saved the whales. It is rather a political decision, an international ban on whale hunting, right? It was really powerful. Then you got other examples. I think an example which people in France like, but it's not. I don't see it as actually a very good example. But it's like France got out of fuel electricity with a big nuclear plan in the 1970s and 80s. Interestingly enough, it has decreased the CO2 emissions of France, obviously, but it is far, far, far. We are far, far, far away from the climate objective, even with this massive plan. And if you take the imports into account, I mean, the CO2 emissions of France in the 90s and 2000 have stagnated. There's no really strong decarbonization of the French way of life. Of the French economy, there is, but of the French way of life, which depends on all sorts of goods that we import, has not, right? So I think it's really, and then part of the decrease of the CO2 emission is deindustrialization of the Western Europe, basically, of Britain and France, the same story. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's no good example, I think, something analogous to what we have to do. I mean, just take Norway. Look at Norway. They have a zero electricity system because they've got a lot of water resources, hydraulic electricity. They have very strong penetration of electric cars. I don't know the exact figures, but now they're selling, almost only electric cars. But look at the CO2 emission. Look at their CO2 emissions on the IEA, International Energy Agency website. You see that it does not decrease a lot. I mean, it has even increased actually recently. So no, I mean, really, we have to think about material consumption as really a key factor. And what strikes me is like in Western Europe, at least, we keep talking about should we go nuclear, should we go renewable, or whatever. And it's really like the kind of civil war between the two. But one of the big issue about French climate emissions, CO2 emissions, is our imports. So we should be talking about, trade. Trade is a major issue, and we don't talk so much about that. If at all.
I think we've got 9 minutes left, but would either of you like to say hi before I wind us up?
I'd be happy to.
Introduce yourself, Rupert.
Just full disclosure, I'm actually a Kiwi, so I'm also international. And I'll just introduce myself for the benefit of everyone except Peter, who I met last week, who invited me here. So I'm basically a PhD student at the moment, academic background, electrical engineering. And so I've dabbled in the grid and energy side of things, but sort of by profession, more sort of electronics and manufacturing. Quick question would be, I see a lot of consumerism, a lot of maybe planned obsolescence built into a lot of the things that are built that consume resources. But I've heard this concept of the circular economy, so to speak, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that buzzword.
Well, I think the same kind of buzzword as energy transition. It's very convenient, but probably not very empirically true. I mean, there are many problems. I actually wrote a small paper on the history of this idea of circular economy, and actually, it's a very old idea. I mean, the buzzword is new, but the idea that industries will be well connected. They will, like an industry will use the residue of another industry. It's really the project of early 19th century specialists on pollution. And for the case of Paris, which I studied, you got a special council of experts, and they really saw their task as connecting all the manufacturers and workshops together, so there is no pollution, that every residue will be reused and so on. So it's really an old program. In a way, you could say it has worked, because if we had the same kind of technologies Nowadays, with the quantity we produce, it would be a disaster. I mean, compared to I mean, if we're using 19th century technology with 20th century scale, it would be an absolute disaster. So, I mean, part of it has work in a way, but still, I mean, for in many respects, the idea of recycling is problematic. Like for plastic, you don't recycle plastic very well. Even steel, I mean, I thought that steel was very well recycled. And then I discussed with a specialist of that. He told me, no, actually, like when you use mobilium in steel to make a more resistant steel, most of the time the like automobile manufacturer, they don't want secondary steel. They want primary steel. So in the end, you've got this fancy alliage mixes of metal that end up in construction, which is really the end point of steel, you know, when it is mixed up with other metals. So it's downcycling rather than recycling, and it is especially true for plastic. In the end, the only thing that you can do with plastic, I think it's rug. You know, when you want to clean your feet before entering a house, how's it called?
Yeah,
This is
doormat.
doormat. Yeah, you know you don't need billions of tons of doormat basically. So there are problems about recycling here as well. Yeah, so we should be cautious about all these fancy notions, which you know, and of course, I mean that's why you're probably much less naive than the people I usually talk to, who don't work in the industry, who don't really work in the. And I'm surprised that the best discussion I have is with engineers because they tell me all the problems they encounter, and it's important for I think it's important for them to communicate also on the problems and not only on the solutions. It's really important for democracy.
We're all engineers here, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I see that, and that's no, but I think it's important that you also talk about the difficulties, and that it's not seen as a failure, but it's important for having a proper democratic discussion on climate change, that we understand the limitations of technologies, and that we have a common knowledge about that, and it's not reserved to some expert.
So, Nick, I'm going to pass to you to close us off and give the vote of thanks. And sorry if you had a question.
Oh, sure, that's all right. So, wow. Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste, for a fascinating discussion. Given I can't ask a question, maybe just a provocation would be, I'm curious as to whether, maybe just to comment on our discussion last week, the political implications of the book, I think, really came forth. And so the question of degrowth but obviously I think a question that was raised was, how do we get people excited about that, and an idea of sufficiency and degrowth and efficiency and things like that. And I'm keen to know whether you have, but not today, I think, but just keen to know whether I looked on my shelf and found a book from the 1970s on sort of different. There was, in addition to this sort of crazy high-tech futurology, there was also, I think, a current of people excited about saying we can be more efficient, we can do things differently. So, and I think that's where I draw some optimism from in saying, and I think particularly the book, your term energy amputation, I think really summarizes the character of what we do. And yeah, so thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for your interest. I'm really happy to see that the book is read to New Zealand, Australia. It's really an honor. Thank you very much.
It's an honor for us to hear from you. Thanks, everyone. See you next
Bye.
time.
Thank